Before dawn, you rest your hand on the bakery door. The wood is cool on the street side, still holding the night, while beyond it, a steadier warmth waits in the dark. The lane behind you is narrow and quiet. Houses stand close together, upper stories leaning a little toward one another, shutters closed, windows dark, roofs silvered by a thin wash of moonlight. The town is sleeping, though not entirely still. Far away, a cartwheel complains once over stone and then settles. A dog turns in its sleep. From a gutter, the last drop of yesterday's rain lets go. You lift the latch and step inside, and the air changes at once. It is warmer, softer, touched with flour, ash, and the faint, sweet memory of yesterday's loaves. The door closes behind you with a muffled sound, and the bakery gathers around you like a wool cloak. Here the darkness is not empty. It has shape and purpose. A bench runs along one wall, rubbed smooth by many hands. Broad boards wait for dough. Baskets are stacked mouth down. A long wooden peel rests against the oven wall, polished where palms have held it. Sacks of grain and flour stand in the corner like patient figures. The oven is the heart of the room, wide-mouthed and quiet for now, its masonry storing an old sleeping heat. In some places, bakehouses stood apart because smoke, sparks and open flame were a real concern in crowded streets. Town rules often kept a close eye on ovens. Yet at this hour, before the first flare and before the first customer, the great chamber seems less a danger than a presence, familiar and necessary. You can feel how the whole room has been arranged around it, as if every object knows where to stand in relation to warmth. Bread mattered enough to make such a room necessary. In many parts of medieval Europe, bread supplied a large share of daily food, often more than half, and sometimes far more, for ordinary people. Historians are careful with exact averages because region, season, harvest, and wealth changed the picture. Still, the broad truth is secure. Bread was not a luxury on the edge of life. It stood near the center of life itself. So the night shift begins while the town is still dreaming. Bakers worked at hours unlike most other trades, because dough rises in its own time and ovens must be ready before dawn. Town ordinances, guild customs, and household records all make this plain, even when details differ from place to place. Some bakers worked with apprentices, some with family, some with hired hands. In smaller settlements, many loaves were still made at home. But here, in this room, you stand inside the kind of workshop that tied hunger, craft, and community closely together. In the hush behind the shop, you wake the oven slowly. The first sounds are private ones. A hinge, a scrape, the careful shift of wood set into place. When you open the oven mouth and peer inside, the darkness there is thick and mineral, lined with soot and the baked memory of countless fires. Perhaps some embers remain under the ash, faint as red beads deep in grey. In many bakeries that would be the hope, because a sleeping fire is easier to coax than a dead one is to replace. You stir gently, and now a hidden glow answers. Kindling comes next, dry and thin, chosen not by guesswork, but by habit. The knowledge of firing an oven is difficult to write down completely, because much of it belongs to the hand, the eye and the skin of the face held near but not too near the heat. Written records can tell you that ovens were heated, swept, loaded, repaired, inspected and taxed. Archaeology can show ash layers, scorched floors, and oven mouths worn smooth by use. But the exact judgment of when stone has absorbed enough heat often lived in practice, taught from one person to another. You watch the fire catch in a small orange line. then widen with a low breathing sound. Soon, the room begins to shift around that change. Shadows move gently along the walls. Iron and clay answer with small gleams of their own. Warmth reaches your hands, then your sleeves, then your face. Good heat is not summoned by impatience. It must spread into brick or stone until the oven itself holds it, because many traditional bake ovens worked by stored heat. After firing, embers and ash might be raked out, and the loaves would bake in the chamber from the warmth kept in the walls and floor. Methods varied by region and oven type, but this broad pattern is well supported. Water waits in a bucket, cold enough to sting your fingers. You lift it and feel the honest pull in your arm. Before water pipes became ordinary, every workshop depended on what had been drawn, carried, stored, and kept clean. The plain vessels of the room matter as much as the grand oven. A barrel, a ladle, a basin, a cloth cover, a tub with worn handles, each belongs to bread as surely as flour does. You pour what you need into a bowl and hear the quiet round note it makes. Then flour. The sack mouth loosens, and the pale dust within releases its dry, faintly nut-like scent. Fine flour slips differently from coarser meal. You know it with your fingers before you think it. White bread made from more carefully sifted flour was often associated with greater wealth or higher status, while darker loaves served many ordinary households. Yet the matter was never simple. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, and mixed grains all had their place, depending on climate, soil, taxes, markets, and custom. Bread history resists one single loaf standing for all others. On the table stand tools so ordinary they almost disappear into the work. Bowls, bins, kneading troughs, cloths, baskets, scales, peels, a brush for the oven floor. Some bakeries used large wooden troughs for mixing and fermenting dough. Some households used smaller vessels and simpler arrangements. A baker's bench might be plain, yet deeply suited to its task, wide enough for shaping and scarred enough to show long service. There is inherited knowledge everywhere here, not written inheritance only, though records matter but the inheritance of gesture. How much flour to dust and not waste? How wet a dough may be before it turns unruly? How long to wait? How to feel whether a loaf will spread, spring or hold? As your hands settle into the flour, older centuries seem to lean closer. This work belongs to a very long human story, older than the town around you and older than the stone beneath its streets. Bread did not begin in one single place or one sudden moment. People were working with grains in deep prehistory, grinding wild seeds, mixing meal with water, and cooking simple cakes long before formal bakeries existed. The evidence survives in fragments, grinding stones, charred crumbs, ovens, paintings, and texts. The story is broad, patient, and still partly unfinished. Among the best-known early bread traditions are the flatbreads of ancient Egypt. They are often mentioned because Egypt left unusually rich evidence, not because every beginning happened there alone. Along the Nile, grain agriculture, grinding, dough preparation, and baking became highly developed. Archaeologists and historians have found many signs of bread's importance in both daily and ritual life. Tomb scenes show baking activities. Remains of ovens and molds help scholars reconstruct techniques. Egyptian bakers worked in many forms, from simple rounds to shaped loaves. Leavening, too, seems to have been known there very early, though the exact path by which people discovered and managed fermentation is not fully certain. If you imagine those older kitchens and bake rooms, They are different from yours and deeply familiar at the same time. There is heat, dust, lifting, pouring, waiting. There is grain being ground and dough meeting a surface with a quiet tack. There is attention to weather, to storage, to fuel. There is the knowledge that bread asks for labor before most people wake. In many ancient households, women appear to have taken a leading role in grain processing and bread making. This is well supported in several cultures, though the details always vary by region, class, and period. A universal rule would be too simple. Still, household bread production was often bound to the rhythms of women's work, especially before baking became more concentrated in specialized urban trades. That concentration happened unevenly. In villages and farmsteads, bread could remain a household task for a very long time. In cities where space, fuel, and regulation pressed differently, professional bakers became more visible and more necessary. The bakery you stand in belongs to that later pattern, but it has not lost the memory of domestic hands. Even a commercial bakehouse still depends on gestures first learned in kitchens and courtyards, near family fires and simple hearths. There is comfort in this continuity. A loaf on a medieval board and a flatbread on an ancient hot stone are not the same food, yet they are relatives. Both begin with the same plain faith that grain can be transformed. Seed becomes stalk, stalk becomes kernel, kernel becomes meal, meal becomes dough, dough becomes bread. It is one of humanity's quietest transformations. The causes are tangible: agriculture, storage, grinding, water, heat, fermentation, skill. Yet when flour darkens with water and wakes into something capable of rising, it can still feel wondrous. Beyond the warm walls, the sleeping town is already present in the dough. The people are not yet in the street, and still they shape every choice made in this room. Their hunger determines the hour. Their coins, or lack of them, help decide what kind of loaves will be sold. Their customs influence the grains brought in sacks from nearby fields. Their trust settles here like flour on the boards. A bakery may look self-contained, but it is really a knot tied into the life of the town. Far away from the oven, the story begins in the field. Grain must be grown, cut, gathered, threshed, winnowed, stored, transported, and finally milled. Any break in that chain can be felt at the bakery door. Medieval people understood this keenly because food supply was never an abstract matter. Weather, harvest quality, pests, transport trouble, and local unrest all affected the grain that reached town. Bakers did not control those forces, yet they lived very close to their consequences. Milling is one of the great transformations hidden inside bread. Whole grain is potential. Flour is readiness. For centuries, people ground grain by hand or with animal power, and the labor was heavy. Then, in many parts of medieval Europe, mills widened what could be processed more efficiently. Watermills mattered greatly, and from about the 12th century onward, windmills became especially important in regions suited to them. It would be too neat to say the windmill changed everything at once, because older methods continued and local conditions varied. Still, wind power did alter the rhythm of production. More grain could be milled with less direct human muscle. If you picture the mill, you can almost hear it though it stands elsewhere in the dark. A sail turns under night or dawn wind. Inside, millstones meet with a low, patient grinding voice. Grain pours from hopper to stone, and flour emerges warm, dusty, faintly fragrant. Not all flour is equal. Its fineness depends on stones, grain, setting, and sifting. Bran can be left in or removed to different degrees. So the miller's work and the baker's work are closely linked. Poor flour limits what the best baker can do. The measure matters too. In many medieval towns, bread was subject to close regulation, especially in weight and price. Because bread was a staple, authorities often sought to prevent fraud and steady the market. In England, one well-known framework is called the assize of bread, which connected loaf size and price to the cost of grain. Other places had their own customs and rules. The details differed, but the principle was widespread. When a food is central to survival, rulers and town officials pay attention to it. These rules did not always work perfectly. Enforcement varied. Bakers could face fines for underweight loaves or other offences. Some records preserve the friction of everyday oversight with striking precision, as if a town's sense of fairness could be read in a loaf placed on a scale. In a way, perhaps it could. Bread joined economics, reputation, and bodily need in one object. A short loaf was not merely poor workmanship, it could feel like a breach of trust. You glance toward the scales in the shop and they seem almost ceremonial in their stillness. Metal, wood, and balance embody fairness here. Yet fairness itself was uneven in the medieval world. Wealthier households could command better grain, whiter flour, and finer baking. Poorer households often relied on rougher bread and whatever grains local conditions allowed. Bread reveals class very clearly if you look closely enough. The pale loaf on one table and the dark loaf on another are not merely tastes. They are social facts. Even so, bread crossed social divisions in a way some foods did not. Everyone ate some form of it. It appeared in monasteries and markets, in great houses and small cottages, on feast days and ordinary days. The shape changed. The grain changed, the texture changed, but bread remained present. This is one reason historians describe it as a foundation of the pre-modern diet. The estimate that bread made up 60 to 80% of intake for many medieval people is broad and useful, even if it cannot fit every individual and every region exactly. It conveys the scale of dependence. Now the night finds its true rhythm in your palms. Water meets flour with a soft collapse, and the first stirring is awkward in the way all beginnings are. Dry edges catch and resist. Lumps form and dissolve. The mixture drags against wood, then loosens, then gathers. If leaven has been kept from an earlier batch, or if a prepared starter waits from the day before, you fold that living portion in with care. Medieval bakers used various forms of fermentation, often preserving dough from one bake to begin the next. Precise methods differed, and not every place described them clearly in writing, but the continuity of leaven from batch to batch is deeply rooted. The dough is cool at first, then, as you work it, it grows responsive. Your hands press, fold, turn and draw it back. There is nothing hurried in the movement, though much depends on it. Kneading develops strength, yet not every historical dough would have been handled in exactly the same way modern bakers might handle it. Some breads were wetter, some rougher, some left longer, some shaped with more restraint. It is easy to project modern practice backward too neatly. Better to stay with the broad certainty that bakers learn texture through touch. Soon the dough changes under your palms from shaggy to supple. A faint tackiness remains, enough to remind you it is alive to moisture and warmth. Flour dust rises each time you lift and fold. It settles on your wrists, the bench, the front of your clothes. In the candlelight, each small cloud seems almost golden before fading into the room. The sound is gentle, a padded thump, a slide, a breath. Beside the oven, the fire answers in occasional murmurs. These are the two heartbeats of the shift: heat and dough. Perhaps you are not alone. An apprentice may be with you, sleepy but practiced, fetching water, dusting boards, cutting portions, watching the oven. In some bakeries, family members shared the labour, and work passed along lines of kin as much as formal training. A spouse might keep accounts or shape smaller loaves. A child old enough to help might turn baskets, carry kindling, or sweep. The exact arrangement depends on place, period, and household means. Historical workshops were rarely identical, but bread often gathered people into cooperative motion because there was simply too much to do for one pair of hands. The dough rests for a while, and this waiting is part of the craft, not an interruption to it. Fermentation is one of bread's quiet lessons in patience. Even before bakers knew the tiny organisms involved in scientific terms, they knew behavior. Dough left under the right conditions would swell, soften, sour slightly, and become better suited to the oven. Bakers knew this by repetition. Room temperature mattered. The warmth near the oven mattered. The time between mixing and shaping mattered. So you cover the mass with cloth and let it sit while the fire and masonry continue their own slow work. When you return, your fingertip leaves a brief dent that begins to lift. This too is knowledge without grand language. You divide the dough with a blade, cutting portions by eye and by weight, depending on the loaf and the rules of the town. Each piece is gathered inward, its skin tightened with small turns. Rounds emerge, long loaves emerge, smaller pieces are rolled and tucked. The bench becomes a field of pale forms, each one separate, yet clearly of the same origin. Baskets lined with cloth receive some of them. Others rest on boards dusted with flour or meal so they will not cling. The marks left by basket weave may later pattern the crust. There is beauty here, though no one pauses to declare it. Function and beauty often share a table in old crafts. A neat seam helps a loaf hold shape. A good cut guides expansion. A balanced form bakes more evenly. Practical gestures become graceful because they are repeated until unnecessary motion falls away. Soon, even in darkness, you are not working alone. The bakery begins to widen beyond its own walls. A neighbouring household may have sent prepared dough to the oven if local custom allows shared baking. In some places, communal ovens stood at the centre of village or town life, especially where homes lacked suitable facilities or where fuel had to be used carefully. People brought their dough, their marked loaves, their timing, and sometimes their small worries. The oven turned many separate preparations into one shared rhythm of heat. Communal baking took different forms across regions. In some communities, a lord, monastery, village, or town maintained the oven and people paid to use it. In others, professional bakers provided baking services as well as selling bread. Urban regulations could shape who baked where, and rights over ovens could matter a great deal. Historians are careful here because the arrangement in one district may not fit the next. But the broad picture is clear enough. Bread often emerged from cooperation, whether direct or structured through fees, rules, and long habit. You can imagine the marks cut into dough so families could recognize their loaves. A slash here, a pinch there, a stamp pressed in before proofing. Such signs mattered in a shared oven, where many rounds entered in sequence and came out transformed by the same heat. They also speak to something tender in daily life. Even ordinary bread wanted a sign of belonging. The baker's place in this system was practical and social at once. To tend the oven was to manage time, fuel, space, and fairness. Which loaf entered first? Which needed stronger heat? Which household had paid? Which dough was ready now, and not later? These are small judgments, yet they formed part of a baker's reputation. Bread was too important for the baker to be a marginal figure. In many towns, bakers were woven into the civic fabric, watched by authorities, depended upon by neighbours, and judged daily by the quality of what they produced. Trust settled here in quiet layers. People trusted that flour had not been dishonestly mixed with inferior matter. They trusted the weight was true. They trusted the oven was hot enough and not wastefully overheated. They trusted too that a baker knew the difference between care and haste. In return, bakers depended on customers, millers, grain merchants, fuel sellers, and local officials. A loaf may look self-contained, but socially it is one of the most connected objects on the table. Communal ovens also speak of fuel economy. Heating one substantial oven could be more efficient than maintaining many smaller fires, especially where wood was costly or carefully managed. This practical advantage helped shared baking endure in many places. Bread, then, was never only about taste or craft. It was also about resources, architecture, and the arrangement of neighbourhood life. At last, the first loaves speak in fragrance before they are seen. It begins as a warm grain sweetness, then deepens into something rounder and fuller. The oven has done its hidden work. Moist dough has lifted, crust has set, and the room receives the news before your eyes confirm it. When the peel slides in and returns, the first loaf carries morning with it, even though the sky beyond the shutters may still be grey. You set it down on the board, and the crust gives a faint ticking sound as it meets cooler air. That tiny crackle is one of the bakery's gentlest rewards. The loaf is not motionless after all. It is finishing itself. Steam still moves within, crumbs settling, crust drying. Beside it, another loaf comes, then another, and soon the bench that held pale sleeping dough now holds baked forms in shades of gold and brown, darker or lighter according to grain, heat, and style. No two are entirely identical. Even under habit and regulation, handwork leaves a little variety. One round has opened more boldly at the cut. Another carries the weave of its basket clearly. A finer white loaf may seem lighter and more delicate. A coarser brown loaf appears sturdy and plain. Both matter. Bread across classes was never the same bread, yet each loaf served as a daily anchor. The noble table, the merchant household, the monastery dining room, the town stall, the village bench, the labourer's hand at first light. Each had bread in some form. That wide presence is one reason bread became symbolic in so many cultures. It could stand for hospitality, labour, blessing, scarcity, abundance, home, and the ordinary dignity of eating. Religious traditions often gave it special meaning, yet even outside ritual, bread carried emotional weight. To share bread with someone remained meaningful because the act joined nourishment with companionship. The street begins to stir in earnest. Light seeps thinly around the shutters and under the door. Somewhere close by, another trade wakes. Town mornings were layered, and the bakery was among the earliest voices in that chorus because people needed food before much else could begin. Work in fields, shops, monasteries, and homes all leaned in some measure on what happened here. You breathe in the baked air and think how long this craft has lasted through change. Ancient flatbreads, Household loaves, communal ovens, guild rules, mills turned by wind, town bakeries, rural hearths, all belong to the same broad history. Later centuries would draw much bread production into larger urban systems and industrial methods. That transformation is real and important. Yet it did not erase older knowledge entirely. Many techniques and values continued, carried by bakers who still judged dough by touch and loaves by scent and sound. A bakery can be read as a small archive of material life. Its tools show what mattered. Its scars show where hands repeated tasks. Its soot and ash show how heat was managed. Its surviving records, when they exist, show who was trusted, fined, apprenticed, or taxed. And its bread, though perishable, shows perhaps the most important thing of all: what a community needed every day. When you return to the door, the whole bakery feels changed and familiar at once. It is the same wood beneath your hand, the same latch, the same seam where cool air once met warmth. Yet now, the room behind you hums with finished purpose. The oven has moved from silence to speech, and nearly back to silence again. The boards that were bare are lined with loaves. The scent that had only been a memory when you entered has become present and abundant, carrying grain, smoke, and crust into every corner. You pause there for a moment, standing between worlds. On one side lies the street, slowly visible in the first pale light. On the other lies the workshop, amber in oven glow and candlelight, flour still drifting in the occasional beam like fine winter dust. Those two motions, firelight and drifting flour, seem enough to explain the whole shift. Everything else has remained steady. The walls, the bench, the baskets, the peel, the patient geometry of the room built around heat. Outside, the town is beginning to claim what was prepared in darkness. Soon there will be footsteps, baskets, coins counted, low voices, perhaps a little eagerness from someone hoping for the warmest loaf. But that belongs to the day more than the night, and your journey has lived mostly in the earlier hours, where work was quieter and facts could settle gently into sensation. Bread has been, all along, both simple and immense. It is flour and water. It is regulation and class. It is household memory and civic trust. It is one of the oldest ways people made grain keep company with hunger. What remains most clearly is not only the finished loaf, but the chain of ordinary acts behind it. The ember stirred awake. The water poured. The flour loosened from its sack. The dough pressed and folded under steady palms. The loaves marked, weighed, shaped, and set in rows. The oven floor swept. The peel extended. None of these acts would look grand from a distance. Together, they sustained towns, monasteries, villages, and families for centuries. History often appears in stone walls, royal decrees, and famous dates, but just as often, it lives in recurring necessities. Bread is one of those necessities that reveals nearly everything if you linger beside it long enough. It tells of agriculture and weather, mills and markets, labour and law, women's household work and men's guild work, feast tables and coarse suppers, fuel needs and skilled hands, ancient experiment and medieval routine. Even uncertainty is instructive. We do not know every recipe, every timing, every local custom. Yet we know enough to feel the shape of the life. Early rising, measured flour, careful heat, and a town waiting. The door under your hand no longer feels only cool. A little warmth has travelled through it from the room behind. That too seems like bread's history in miniature. The world outside may still be grey and damp, but through one threshold passes something sustaining, made from plain materials and long practice. The bakery has not become grander in the telling. It has become closer. A workplace, a neighborhood hinge, a keeper of embers and measures. So you stand once more where you began, at the bakery door before dawn, except that dawn is almost here now. The lane is the same lane. The houses remain still, their roofs catching the first spare light. The room behind you glows with the completed first cycle of the shift. Firelight trembles softly. Flour drifts and settles. The loaves rest in quiet rows, warm enough to breathe faintly into the cool air by the threshold. And in that familiar place, held between night and morning, bread returns to what it has always been, an ordinary marvel waiting to be carried home.